Welcome to the JBP Podcast, Season 4, Episode 17 with Paul Rossi. This was recorded April 22nd, 2021. Paul Rossi is a high school mathematics teacher and writer. His April 21st, 2021 essay titled, "I Refuse to Stand By While My Students Are Indoctrinated," was published on Barry Weiss's Substack, Common Sense with Barry Weiss. It's definitely worth a read. Jordan and Paul discuss the controversy surrounding a recent article Paul wrote, that article. It's become apparent that an anti-racism curriculum is being instituted in schools across the U.S., and that doesn't initially sound like anything but a positive change. However, Dad had Paul on to share his concerns about this anti-racism curriculum after working in one of the schools implementing it. This episode is brought to you by Self-Authoring. Self-Authoring is a suite of exercises developed to organize your thinking and plan for the future. It has past authoring, allowing you to write out your past, great for trying to work through trauma, although I'd recommend writing about trauma at minimum a year after it's over so you don't re-traumatize yourself. It has present authoring, which helps you write out your present and identify flaws that you can work on figuring out, and future authoring, which helps you make a plan for the future. With code MP, you get 10% off at selfauthoring.com. If you don't have a goal, you have nothing to aim for. This helps fix that. Selfauthoring.com, code MP. I'd also like to remind listeners that my dad has a personality course available. If you haven't checked it out, it's at jordanbpeterson.com/personality. Over 5 hours of video content plus written content on how to understand personality. It's helped me understand people and relationships better. Enjoy the episode.
Hello, everyone. I'm pleased to have with me today Mr. Paul Rossi. Paul Rossi is a high school mathematics teacher and writer. He graduated from Cornell University with a BA in French literature in 1992 and from Hunter College in New York City with an MA in educational psychology in 2010. He's been teaching mathematics, including Algebra 2 and Calculus, at Grace Church High School in Manhattan since 2012. His April 2021 essay, "I Refuse to Stand By While My Students Are Indoctrinated," was recently published on Substack's Common Sense with Barry Weiss. Ms. Weiss is a former New York Times journalist who resigned over differences with her employer and began to function as an independent investigative writer on Substack. Thank you very much for agreeing to talk with me today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
What's your life like at the moment?
Well, I have a little more time than usual at this point. I would, be teaching classes. I would have up to 3 classes a day, but they've taken my classes away and assigned them to some other folks. And so I basically have no more teaching duties right now. So I have a lot of time for volunteer work and some other things like this, which has been, a good chance to tell my story.
Okay, so you're working at Grace, Grace Church High School, and walk us through what happened. You're a mathematics teacher there, and you published an essay with Barry Weiss last week. Mm-hmm. And tell us about the school first.
Well, we're a K through 12 school that opened up a high school in 2012. So that it was K through 8, and then they opened a 9th grade, and then as the 9th moved to the 10th, and they brought in another 9th grade, and so we had a complete high school by 2016. And our high school is it's a prep school, but over the course of particularly the last 5 years, 5-6 years, we've been implementing an anti-racist curriculum programming for our students, as well as, because as we were told in 2015, diversity, equity, and inclusion is not enough, and we needed to move towards a so-called anti-racist pedagogy and program.
So that was beyond diversity, inclusivity, and equity.
Right.
And
right.
It's a private high school.
Private high school. That's right. It's called independent.
The tuition is approximately how much a year?
I believe that's up to 57,000 a year. I think. It's somewhere between 50 and 60.
And how big a school is it?
Well, our high school has about 340 students in it. And, maybe 100, 120 faculty. I'm not really sure what the ratio is, faculty and staff.
Did you enjoy teaching there?
I did. I love teaching math. It's a wonderful thing. And I got into teaching math late, but it's something that I really enjoy. This year has been hard because I've been teaching hybrid, which means I teach both on Zoom, or I guess until recently, and to students in the classroom simultaneously. So that's been a technical challenge. It's also been a challenge to keep everybody engaged and also to focus my attention where it needs to be. So this has been a difficult year.
Yes, I imagine so. Would you have considered your relationships with your faculty peers and the administration and the students? Was that essentially positive during the duration of your tenure as a teacher there?
Yeah, I would say it has been positive. I mean, my colleagues, they sort of know where I stand. I haven't taken great pains to hide my thinking. In some cases, I've gotten into some spats with them over differences in the way that the programming has been delivered, and essentially the foundations, the belief, the system of belief which animates it. But I will say, I've had very cordial relations with the Dean of Equity and Inclusion and the Office of Community Engagement. As people, I find to get along.
And with the students?
And the students, I had a difficult first couple of years as a teacher. It took me some time to really settle on a personality that worked for me, but I kind of, by hook or by crook, worked out a kind of performative self that functioned well enough, to teach pretty well. I mean, I won't say I'm an excellent teacher. I'm decent. I'm pretty good by now, but it has taken a while.
And is this something that you had planned to continue pursuing? Did you see yourself, apart from, let's say, this incident, did you see yourself in the teaching profession for the long haul? I was thinking I would want to be a teacher for the duration, and I didn't really ever consider leaving teaching until probably this year. What did you like about teaching?
I like the energy. Yeah, I like the energy of the students, and I like to communicate with them about what I find true and beautiful about mathematics. Mathematics was for me personally, when I got back into it and teaching, I found that it was a sort of island in the storm of the culture wars and the sort of general epistemological chaos, which I find in language and discourse.
Right, because you have a BA in French literature, and I don't presume that your MA in Ed Psych was math focused, but I could be wrong. Was it?
No, it was not. It was not.
Okay, so
focused.
It's interesting that you ended up teaching math, and also it's interesting that you founded an island in a storm. And I suppose that the way that you talk about it makes it sound like that was a relief.
Yeah,
and a
very
relief
much.
From what exactly?
It's a bit of a long story. At Cornell, I studied the humanities. I had a history major, English major, and French lit major as an undergrad. And me and my merry band of friends and cohort of compatriots, we were really into postmodernism. We really loved the paradoxes of language. We studied Derrida and Foucault and Lyotard and Baudrillard, and there was a certain enthusiasm, even a lust for paradox that we had, and I personally had. reading texts and sort of finding out how words can mean their opposite, how meanings can be seen to be taken different ways. And I guess I would say that I had a kind of a breakdown from that, and that I didn't really, once I realized I didn't want to become a professor or go into, the academic world, because I found that even then I was being pushed to say things I didn't believe. I kind of drifted for a decade, I would say, trying to find something that was meaningful.
So back when you were an undergraduate, you found the postmodernists emotionally, motivationally, intellectually engaging, and you talk about that as something that was also true of the people that you were associating with. So I get the sense that there was some sense of intellectual adventure. And what was it? What did postmodernism mean to you, and why do you think you were attracted to it? What was exciting about it?
Well, there was a poetic sensibility. It was non-political. In fact, the true materialist Marxists that were sort of in our social milieu, they would sort of scoff at us and say that we were bourgeois.
Oh, that's what Marxists do.
Yeah, right. So, we were just playing with language, and there really was no there. And actually what would deliver us from our current predicament was some revolution in terms of material circumstances. And so, but I was really drawn to the creativity of reading a text in a way. I looked at it as a way, like I wasn't talented enough to be a writer, but I could critique something in a creative way and sort of get my revenge, in a sense, like on the text, right? Because
that's a hell of a way to put it. When did you figure out that that's what you were doing?
I think I kind of knew it at the time, but later on reflection, I felt when I tried to be a writer in my 30s and got nowhere, and became very frustrated and despondent and depressed, I thought back at that time and I realized that a lot of criticism itself is the kind of criticism that we were doing is a kind of shaking your fist at the creative process and sort of gaining power over art by interpreting it in a way that you found, that I found, fit my world. And so it is,
what do you think the pleasure in, I mean, you're making a case for the pleasure in that. You said to some degree that you think it was born out of, well, it's something like frustration and I don't want to put words in your mouth. I truly don't. I'm trying to extract out exactly what you're saying. And so if I'm wrong, please correct me. You had, and perhaps this is not rare among people who are studying literature at elite colleges. I mean, you'd have some desire to think philosophically, to be seen as a philosophical thinker, to be seen as a creative writer, to be a creative writer. There's a romanticism about that. And of course, that ability is what the whole enterprise depends on. So it's sort of at the apex. But you describe what you were enthralled by, at least to some degree, as revenge against not only the text, but against the creative process itself as a consequence of what? What would the emotion be?
I guess it would say, like, I wanted to be creative, but I just couldn't, I didn't feel like I had anything to say. And I felt that my authority was deeply compromised just by my privilege or my place in the world. But I could reach back into Shakespeare and reinterpret Shakespeare in a way that, made me feel powerful. I could expose the contradictions.
Also true, do you think of your peers, and what about your professors?
I think it was. I don't know their state of mind, but I feel like a lot of what animated that high postmodernism, it was, but it also had an element of appreciation, just like in the way that Marx admires capitalism. There was an element of, wow, this is amazing, but it's kind of actually saying the opposite, and just dwelling in that.
Right, you wouldn't be attending to it at all if you weren't in some sense in awe of it, right? Because right. Why attend to that and not something else? So that has to be there at least implicitly. So and then after you were finished with college, you said you you weren't sure exactly what direction to go in, and you tried writing. And you also mentioned, let's get back to that in a minute, but you also mentioned that you discovered that you didn't have anything to say, and also you felt that your authority was compromised. Okay, so those are two different things. They're worth delving into. It's not that surprising that you didn't have anything to say in some sense, because, I mean, you were an undergraduate, and what do you know when you're an undergraduate? I mean, there are staggering geniuses that come along who seem, as an intrinsic part of them, to just overflow with brilliant creativity, but that's pretty damn rare. And it's hard to have anything to say when you haven't lived much yet. But then, so it sounds like you were hard on yourself because of that, but also your authority, you said you thought it was compromised. What do you mean by that exactly?
Well, even then, I mean, I took some creative writing classes, and even then there was a consciousness of identity politics, and that the real stories that would advance society would not come from a white male perspective. So I kind of bristled at that, but I didn't feel like I could. So your lived
experience wasn't of, what would you call, interest? It wasn't of redemptive interest.
Right. Like I had things to say, but the people didn't really seem to value my perspective. So I kind of swallowed what I had to say.
I had a friend, I wrote about him extensively in not this last book I wrote, but the previous book. And he was very guilty for his existence as, this was years ago, as a white male. And he virtually refused to participate in society at all because he had swallowed hook and sinker, I suppose, the proposition that any manifestation of ambition on his part was to be viewed as part of the world-destroying force. It eventually killed him. It was complicated, but that was certainly amotivational, let's put it that way, or anti-motivational in a very profound way. So, and some of that was his own cynicism, but some of it was a certain emotional sensitivity to the potential impact his existence had on oppressed others, let's say. At least that's how he came to view it. So,
yeah. I mean, and I also had a lot of rage in that, I felt like when my friends were organizing things like, Greenpeace and so on, I would be kind of a LARPing. They would call it LARPing today, but I would say, oh, well, you just tell me when you're ready to throw a bomb. And I was obsessed with things like, violent revolutions. I wanted to learn how to hack and freak with phones, and without any real goal in mind other than to disrupt and break things. And so I guess, I'm actually lucky there wasn't an Antifa back then. I probably would have been a part of it.
And what do you think attracted you to that? I'm very curious about this because Antifa, for example, I understand the attraction. There's a romantic attraction to revolution. I had a debate with Slavoj Žižek hypothetically about Marxism, although it didn't really go that way. But when I was unpacking the Communist Manifesto, and I mentioned that it was a call to bloody, violent revolution, and the crowd, which was a very poorly behaved crowd in many ways, broke out laughing and clapped, which really took me aback because I wasn't promoting violent revolution in any positive sense, and I know exactly where those revolutionary sentiments got us in the 20th century. But by the same token, there is a romantic attraction to rebellion, right? I mean, and it's linked to something very deep, which is the sense that we all have to some degree that we are a minority of one against a faceless bureaucratic tyrant hell-bent on at least shaping us into the form that it demands and commands, and that structure is to be viewed even realistically with a certain degree of skepticism and regarded at least to some degree as an arbitrary tyrant. And to stand up against that, well, that there is something intrinsically heroic about that, although it can go very dreadfully wrong. And it's something that, young people, are called to that. I mean, the developmental psychologist Jean Piaget pointed out that there's a messianic stage of late adolescent development where not everyone hits it, but a certain number of people hit it, and that manifests itself in a laudable, perhaps, concern with broader issues in the world as part of identity formation. That all is supposed to be catalyzed and shaped in universities, so it doesn't find channels that are fundamentally destructive psychologically and socially. So anyways, back to you. So you were stymied to some degree in your creative endeavor, and you found some outlet for that frustration with postmodernism. But then there was also this deeper and darker attraction to some degree that you just described. How have you made sense out of that in the intervening years?
I think it really was a resentment at not being able to be creative in my own life, not being able to have a generative, healthy, creative life. I mean, a way to deal with certain impulses and channel them productively.
And why do you think you believed that that was the appropriate destiny for you to begin with?
Well, the great thing is that, I was able to work out issues with my father. And, if you have problems with authority, there's nothing more attractive than, I feel for myself anyway, is a blank check morally. Because then if you're doing things for the benefit of the world, well, then you can take out all kinds of debt. You can say, well, I don't have to be a good person because I believe in all the right things, and I can do whatever I do is instrumental to the coming of a better world. So I made my mother's life miserable. I would argue with my father. I was posing, but I was inhabiting the pose so deeply that I would give myself some, I could justify anything by the fact that everyone else was wrong and I was right. And, I found that as a way to deal with things. And it's a real high. I mean, it's a really wonderful, thrilling thing to inhabit. Even though, now today I look at it I'm very embarrassed by it. But it's understandable. I mean, it could have been no other way, really.
Why do you think why aren't you like that now? What changed for you?
Well, I went through, I would say teaching changed me a lot, because teaching was a way for me to express myself creatively and be engaged in the world in a regular, habitual, productive way where I could tangibly see the benefits of my efforts. And it was it's a social thing, teaching, and it's a performative thing, teaching, and it's very creative. And, every day would be different. There would be new kids and they would have different problems. And, they would bring to me, their own cultural reference points. So it's just constant renewal. Teaching is just a constantly renewing and self-renewing endeavor. So I realized that with other jobs that were technical or, that were rote, those became boring very, within 3 or 4 years. But after teaching for over, 6-7 years, I was like, this still isn't boring. I could do this forever. I love this.
So you found a way to contribute that was concrete and habitual and regular and routine, and that actually sufficed to satiate your creative impulse, and that removed your resentment, would you say, or
I would say it just kind of it tempered it and made me not worry about it so much. I can't say it evaporated totally. I mean, I still have I guess I'm an oppositional guy in some sense, but as far as institutions go, but I was able to just focus on my work and on the kids and trying to be good at what I do and enjoying it.
And were you teaching before you went back to Hunter College or after?
No, I had been tutoring for a while before that, and I turned to teaching when the reason why I actually got the degree in educational psychology, it's a story in itself. And that was one where it was a desperate attempt to avoid suicide, essentially. Like I was so depressed at that point in my life that I felt just compressed into this tiny little ball, and there was no way out. I was just, how I got to that point is a whole other thing. But I just went on the internet and I was like, what is the last thing that I remember enjoying in my life? When is the last time I actually felt a part of something? And it was when I was tutoring kids I had done some light tutoring, and I was like, okay, education.
That's really crucially important. So because what you just said is, you were in despair.
Yeah.
And then you were looking for something that was genuinely redemptive, and you were searching your memory for that, and you found that in mentoring. Okay, yeah. Why? What was it about mentoring that had enough value that it pulled you out of that pit, or that you could see that as a pathway out?
It was just the experience that I remembered of being with someone and being able to give them something that they could use, and having that exchange be rewarding.
See, I've been very struck by the postmodern insistence that hierarchies are predicated on power and are to be viewed with contempt as the manifestation of tyranny and as self-serving, selfish institutions. And I believe that is true when the hierarchies become corrupt. But what I've observed as the appropriate counterposition is that the people that I've seen who I've admired the most, who are working diligently in institutions, find the biggest pleasure in their life in mentoring. And it's a profound pleasure. There's something about allowing the best in you to serve the best in others that can't be beat by any other form of reward. And a hierarchy that's functioning properly, I think, has the central aspect of a benevolent father, which is something like encouragement. It's certainly not exploitation by power. And it's unbelievably cynical to make the case that that's the central aspect of functional institutions. Having said that, I understand that institutions can become corrupted by tyranny and power and deceit. But I do believe that the basis upon which a stable and productive hierarchy must be instituted is something like the paternal care for the upcoming generation. And I also believe that we do take the most intense pleasure in that. So it's very fascinating for me to see that when you were scouring your memory and inhabiting a place that was quite cynical and resentful, that turned out to be the doorway that you could pass through. And then you went back to university. And it was a consequence of your experiences with tutoring. Do you remember any particular episodes when you were tutoring that stood out in your mind?
It's just sort of an image that I have of being with, with a young person and, having them focused on what they're doing and me feeling connected to what they were doing. And just that it wasn't even a specific image. It was just sort of something in my body that felt good. I mean, and I really wasn't thinking about it any more than that at that point. Like it was literally just totally selfishly, when was the last time I felt any reward in life?
Right. Well, that's a dead serious empirical question. If you're seeing a good therapist, if you're depressed, one of the things that therapist will ask you to do is to watch your life and see if there's anything that lifts you out of your miasma. And it's not a matter of thinking about it exactly. It's a matter of paying attention. And it's often surprising. You stumble across something and you think, oh, that makes me happy, or that alleviates my misery. And I really didn't notice that before. It wasn't part of my theory. It just happened to be a fact that I was overlooking. It's dreadfully important it can be life-saving as you found out. So, okay, so you went to Hunter College, and you did an MA in educational psych. What was that like?
Oh, it was, I almost bailed out of the application process. Well, I had chosen education in the Google search, but then I think, well, I got to pair it with something else that I like. So I just put psychology down. I was interested in psychology, and the first thing that popped up was educational psychology degree. And I found like, oh, there's something here. It's a city college. I can get the degree, and if I spend $10,000, which I saved up for my previous job, I could get this thing. So I go. I almost fill out the application, and then I kind of get wobbly and tell, what's the point? I'm not going to, it's not going to do anything. And then, I remember calling my mother. My mother called me, and she, they worried about me because I was, really lost, in my 30s and 40s. And she said, you got to go through this. She kind of got hysterical because I think she just couldn't handle like another failed endeavor on my part, or just getting my act together. And I, just to calm her down, I went through with it, because she was getting hysterical. And
well, it's good to have people around that will actually support your attempts to move forward, especially when you're fighting with yourself. And I've seen so many people, they're 51-49 about moving forward, or 49-51. And so they're not doing it, and someone else can come behind them and give them a little tap. But there are lots of people who don't have that. And so then they don't get that little tap. And, it wouldn't have taken much to push them over the threshold. So,
yeah, I was lucky. So, I got in, and then once I started moving, I would go to classes. I was tutoring on the side and making money that way. And I was able to do that. And then, I was going to class, I was making friends. I remembered how much fun school was. I was doing assignments, and I was like, oh my God, I just have to write this paper. Life made sense again, because it brought back sort of all of the enjoyment of undergraduate life that I really liked, which is social. And so it really was just a momentum thing, like just getting back into it. And then,
and what was the curriculum like at that point?
Oh, it wasn't, it was a little bit, I guess educational psychology, it was more of a research focused thing rather than an education degree. So we were considered more, a science oriented research thing, like, we studied research methods. It was fairly rigorous, compared to some education degree programs. So we didn't, we were sort of, insulated from a lot of the nutty stuff that was going on.
Right. So that's like an island too, in the same way that the STEM fields were somewhat of an island. So, okay. So you came out of Hunter College, and you were in better shape, I presume, by that time?
Yep. And then I applied to some various teaching positions. I kind of made my bones, so to speak, at some different places. Like I worked at a Hagwon, I think it's called the Hagwon, a Korean summer school, 8 hours a day drilling SAT stuff. I worked at a failing school teaching, tutoring SAT for a while, or ACT. And that was, really, really heartbreaking, because, those kids, they hadn't had the same math teacher for longer than 6 months, and they were seniors and they couldn't add fractions. It was heartbreaking. And then I applied to Grace Church School. It was a new school that was starting up, and I was able to sort of tell a little story. I had also published a book out of high school called Up Your Score: The Underground Guide to the SAT with two friends. And, that was kind of a fun little project. And that book was still selling a little bit. So I was sort of able to piece together a kind of, out of my hodgepodge life, make a little package. And I did a demo lesson, and then they liked me. And then I got hired in the inaugural faculty for Grace Church School.
And so what was it like going to teach at Grace Church School?
Well, it was really nice because, you know, I was used to a corporate environment, I guess. Because of my time that I had done in a previous job at HBO. I was a technical manager. It was a whole other career. And, you know, I was very concerned that I reported to the right people, or, you know, what's the org structure, you know, and they were just like, well, you know, just, you have colleagues and you can discuss things with them, and we're not going to make you do anything. You can talk to us. It's a very friendly environment. I mean, there were serious expectations, like, you know, and everyone took their jobs very seriously, but there really was a sense of belonging and community. That was very welcoming, actually, and very energizing, I will say, because I wasn't used to that. I didn't expect it. And so I would remain aloof from it, you know, at the beginning, like, what are these people? Why are they always smiling at me? Like, what's going on? You know, like, I don't know why. But gradually you loosen up, and you know, it was kind of corny, but I would kind of go along with it. And
it's a good kind of corny.
Yeah. And it did actually, you know, I warmed up a little bit. I did feel like I was a part of things, and I was able to sort of transmit that to others too.
And so what happened over time?
It was a very gradual change that, you know, I would say, well, within the first 3 years, one of the tenets of our school was that every employee and every faculty and staff member had to attend a seminar called Undoing Racism.
Mm-hmm. That was your HR department, was it, or who?
Yeah, it was. It was a mandate from the dean of faculty at the time, and
that was a requirement.
Yeah, mm-hmm. And you know, so I went to that, and that was a very interesting experience.
You know, it's hard to what would you say, refuse a call to anti-racism.
Sure.
Who would do that?
What kind of monster? Yeah. And I went into it, and I actually felt energized, and I was converted. You know, I had a sort of, you know, I am white and I'm privileged, and you're right, we need to take care of this. And there were people in a circle, and people of all different races and backgrounds, and it was facilitated. And, you know, later I looked back on it, and I realized sort of how they did it. They did it in a very interesting, seductive way.
And what way was that?
Well, you know, as I recall, they started out, well, there was sort of two parts. The first part was the history since, you know, the slave ships landed on American soil, and then throughout time leading up to the present. And then they focused, for the second half of the session, they focused on, you know, how to help a community that has been shaped by all of this. And very early in the session, they said, we want you to withhold any judgment of anyone's choice or agency. Anyone, you know, any of, you know, the minority Black populations that we're talking about here. We want you to simply bracket or put, you know, withhold any analysis of the choices that people make, because, you know, that will often lead to a misunderstanding or insensitivity towards what's happening.
Okay, so why do you focus on that specifically, that issue specifically?
Well, because, you know, it was as they retold the history, and as they talk about the present circumstances, they never actually revisited that. So you're constantly focused on the oppressed population in terms of what is acting upon it, in terms of acting upon those individuals. And, you know, to me, that's like denying a certain agency, right? But they never actually lifted the blinders off at the end. Like they would put everyone sort of acknowledged that they were going to go along with this at the beginning. And I was like, really? We're going to do that? We're going to treat people as less than human? Well, okay, it must be like a temporary thing.
And why did you see that as treating them as less than human? I mean, I presume that the people on the other side of the fence would say, well, you know, we're all caught like corks on the sea in the throes of vast social movements over which we have little or no control. And who are you to cast judgment on people who have been relatively deprived in that regard compared to you? It's possible to make a fairly stringent moral case that that's the appropriate mode of behavior, but there was something in you that objected to that, and you remember that now.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that you said that you were energized by this and pulled in by it. Why do you think it caught you as well?
Well, it was a social thing, right? It's the people in a circle, and people are talking about their experiences, and people are saying, as a Black person, this has happened to me. And at one point they actually, it's empathy, right? You care about people. You feel, if you're sitting face to face with someone, of course I'm going to be sympathetic and empathetic, and people are narrating, but the problem, I think, is generalizing that to groups and, getting you to make a different set of assumptions about those groups based on a sort of, selective way that the empathy is leveraged, I would say.
Well, there's also the implicit, what would you say? The implicit perceptual and categorical structure that comes along with it, which is the a priori assumption that the appropriate classification for human beings is by group.
Yeah.
And that's so implicit, but so pervasive that it, in some sense, never needs to be stated. And as soon as you assume that the group level is the appropriate level, then you're bound to minimize or even forbid discussion of such things as individual agency. So there's something, if you believe in individual agency, there's something
I guess
pernicious about that.
Yeah. And I don't, I remember at one point they said, what do you like about being white? That was sort of a gotcha question that they asked the white people.
How did you answer that?
Well,
I'm trying to think of how it's some of these questions seem to come up in our society right now that no one's ever asked, justify marriage. It's like, well, wait a sec. I don't know how to justify it. We just sort of took that for granted, and maybe that was appropriate.
Right.
And so it's very hard when you're put on the spot like that. Okay, so you're white. What's so great about that, as far as you're concerned?
Well, I kind of knew what they were expecting, so I kind of tried to play games with it a little bit, because what they were trying to do is they're trying to go through the embarrassment of saying, well, there's nothing special about me being white. There's nothing special. But I was just like, no, it's great. I walk into a room and everyone pays attention to me and everyone thinks I'm an expert. And I said it because I knew that it's kind of what they wanted. But, I don't usually feel that way, but I knew that's kind of what they wanted. But then I said it too, proudly, and then I made some other people upset. Like some people sounds like you really, really like being white. And I said, well, I'm not, that's just how I've been socialized. And then it was turned into kind of an argument. And then the facilitator had to defend me because I actually had told him what he wanted to hear. And it turned into kind of a bit of a difficult moment. So I had to say that it was good to be white, but not be too happy about it.
Do you think is it a reasonable question?
I think the unreasonable part is more interesting. It's reasonable if you take
spoken like a true postmodernist.
If you take racial identity as, well, gets into a whole identity thing that I could talk about, but
please do.
Okay, so we know that race is a folk taxonomy. Okay, it's not. It has, groups. And correct me if I'm wrong. This is my understanding. I'm not an expert. I'm a math teacher, so this is what I've learned. But you can be sure that
no matter what you say, you're wrong. So.
I'm sure I'm wrong. But take it for what it's worth. If you don't like it, just stop watching now. As I understand it from my race is a folk taxonomy. Groups or individuals vary more within the groups than between the groups. It doesn't correspond in any meaningful way to, I guess IQ changes over time and things. It just doesn't have a lot. It's not a true thing. It's not a true thing. So when people say, what do you like about being white? It requires you to accept.
Family resemblance category. And so a family resemblance category, it's a very strange sort of category. So imagine that there's a category of 11 items, and if you have 4 of them, you're in that category. And what that means is that two things in that category can have two different sets of 4 attributes and still be in the same category. Psychiatric diagnostic categories are like that. So maybe there's 11 symptoms, and if you have 4, you're in the category. So it's got edges like a proper set, which are the categories that we usually use in science, like triangles you can define completely. And you can tell what is and what isn't a triangle. There aren't shades of triangle, essentially, and they're very distinguishable from squares. But family resemblance categories we use a lot, but they're not scientific categories. They have their utility, and we use them a lot. So, okay, so anyways, back to race.
So, it's something that's not true. And if you require someone to identify with a lie, you are creating this sort of fundamental distortion. Now, I understand that racism is real. That is, this lie is instantiated in the world, and it's, as a social construct, it has had tremendous effects on history. But I've often wondered is the utility. It's not even
that obvious that racism exactly is real, because it's hard to distinguish from in-group preference, for example. You know what I mean? And fear of novelty, for example. And it's complicated. I'm not saying that I'm not saying that racial bias has never existed, but when you delve into it, it becomes extremely complicated. And it's very important if you look at things like the hypothetical racism that the implicit association test measures. It's by no means obvious that what it's measuring is only, racism at all, but only racism, because of all these other issues. And it is difficult. We tend to be in favor of in-group favoritism in certain situations, and they're very violently opposed to it in others. So it's complicated and murky. But your fundamental point is, there's an insistence perhaps that race is socially constructed and arbitrary, and yet it's the most fundamental attribute that defines a person.
Right, and that in our school, after we adopted a curriculum, in 6th grade, and maybe even earlier, but I happened to notice this in the curriculum, there is an exploration of identity where, and I would actually really like to hear your thoughts on this. The individual identity is sort of acknowledged, right? Your interests, preferences, dreams, aspirations, personality, character, all of those things are really important. And you also have a social identity. And your social identity is how other people see you. And you're born into this world where certain social identities are valued more than others. And so they kind of lead you outside the house of your self-understanding into this world of social impinging. And gradually you sort of become separated. I think that the effect of this is you should prioritize how other people see you when you have a self-concept. Before you even really know who you are, or you really have developed yourself, you're supposed to sort of, I think the kids are supposed to sort of hold it in abeyance and then prioritize, how other people view you. And I don't think that's healthy.
What did you see as the consequences of that in the school? I mean, obviously, this is starting to bother you as this. You buy into it to begin with, and you're enthusiastic about it to begin with, and you attribute that to the mechanics of the initial education. Let's say it's a group phenomenon. It capitalizes on empathy. And it sounds benevolent, certainly. In fact, it's the very essence of benevolence in some sense. So it's going to be seductive, regardless of whether or not it's correct. But you become uncomfortable with it. Well, the first thing you're uncomfortable with is that you were implicitly asked to produce a falsehood in relationship to your own identity, which was when you were asked the question about what you liked about being white. And you said that what you said wasn't right exactly, or wasn't correct, wasn't true. It was something that you whipped up on the spot because of the nature of the demand of the situation. And you remember that, so obviously that's significant.
I think I was just meeting what I thought was an absurdity with an absurdity. Like I felt the question was a little bit absurd. It's sort of like the premise,
right?
The premise is, what do you call it? Like how long have you been beating your wife kind of question. So the premise of whiteness is you have to accept the premise in order to answer the question. I really have never been comfortable with the premise, period, because I don't think that it,
right. And it takes a lot of presence. It takes a lot of presence of mind when you're asked a question, to question the question, especially when you're the student and it's the teacher that's, so to speak, it's the authority figure that's posing the question, because you immediately have to rebel and you have to do it in an extremely sophisticated way.
Yeah. And, this could get back to the school and I might not have passed the class and, I'm white, so that would have been problematic. And why are you, and that might have had job repercussions or, promotions or whatever, you realize that to question the question.
This is also mandatory.
Yeah. And to question the question in these circumstances is, the risk of that is so much greater than the triumph of dismantling the question, that you're never going to, and you may even fail at dismantling the question. Like your little rebellion may lead nowhere and you may be wrong, which is the hesitation that anyone would have with an objection, just that you might be wrong. And so, of course, you're just going to fall on that side of the equation. I mean, that's what I did. Some people don't, but
most people do.
Yeah.
And no wonder.
Right.
It's hard not, like you outlined a bunch of reasons why it's difficult to, come up with exactly the right response at that second. It's not like it's a question you're prepared for.
Right. And, I think the students do it all the time, because there's tremendous social cost to challenging any of the assumptions of our anti-racist programming or the manner in which it's delivered.
What are the costs for the students?
Social opprobrium. You could have, teachers write recommendations for them if they get a reputation, that there's a fear that it could affect their applications. Students have come to me with, concerns and examples of papers that they wrote, say, on taking a position that went against the orthodoxy, and they've, suffered a grade hit from it. And I've asked them, like, are you sure it just wasn't a good paper? Are you sure? And then like, no, I actually cited this, and this, and I still, and so I think they're real. I think that they're real. And there's actually been, stories that they brought to me that are, someone defends capitalism or something, and then they have a big talking to after class or something like that, which is just.
Well, yes. I mean, how could you possibly defend capitalism while you're going to a $55,000 a year private school?
Right.
I mean, what's the probability that your parents are capitalists? 100%.
Very high.
So basically, you're being set to task because you have the gall to defend the very attribute of your parents that enabled you to go to the school in the first place, and that, of course, enabled the school.
Right. And it's such an ironic thing that both the administration and most faculty have such contempt for the very thing that makes them have a job. Like they believe that if in order to achieve
Why do you think they have contempt for that, given that it's the very thing that allows them to have a job? I mean, this is associated with the question we discussed earlier, right, about you being resentful back when you were an undergraduate. It seems to me, and let me let you answer. I won't push.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good connection to make. I mean, we all, if you have baked in a resentment of authority and see all order as tyrannical, well, then, even the hand that feeds you is going to be a tyrant. And so,
well, it's also so convenient. I've watched among my professorial peers, I've worked with business schools, for example, quite frequently, and I have my own companies and did while I was a professor. And I'm not an anti-capitalist. And many of my colleagues would sneer at my involvement with the business school. And I thought, okay, so what's going on here? It's like, I know lots of businessmen, and like, look, there's plenty of businessmen who have contempt for academics. So it's not like it's a one-way street. And I feel just as dubious about the capitalists, let's say, the entrepreneurs who sneer at the ivory tower as I do about the ivory tower inhabitants who sneer at the capitalists. But my sense always was, it was something like, well, look, I have an IQ of 145 and I'm not getting paid $700 an hour like my corporate counterpart on Bay Street or Wall Street. And I work just as hard, which is true, by the way, because top-rated professors work, 60, 70, 80-hour weeks to keep on top of the research, just like the high-end lawyers do in corporate law offices. But they're not rewarded financially to nearly the same degree. And so to me, it was always just a matter of straight out envy. It's like, well, if this society was structured properly, professors would make a hell of a lot more than corporate lawyers. It's like, well, yeah, except you have tenure and complete creative freedom. And, that's actually worth something. So, and how dare you complain when you're a tenured professor because you have the best job in the world. So, anyways, so back to the faculty at the high school.
Yeah, I think, well, this is not the case for all of them, and I really don't want to generalize too much. But it does seem that in certain of the humanities subjects, it tends to be more, radical questioning of, the foundations of, what creates inequity in the, over at these schools, which are, it's almost like the more opportunity these schools offer, the more they're part of a problem, I think, is the view, in the sense that, it's, if you're offering some opportunity, right? Like if you're offering the opportunity to these elite kids, well, then what about all the other kids, which is a good question. But then, instead of sort of figuring out, the best ways to help the people that need it, the focus is on sort of, questioning and interrogating the site of the top end of the inequality.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's an interesting moral conundrum, right? If you're working at an elite private school and your conscience is bothered by inequality, and I mean, virtually everybody's conscience is bothered by inequality. There's very few people that walk down the street and celebrate tripping over a homeless person. The typical person would rather set the world up so that people didn't fall out of the system in such a painful manner. So you have that plaguing your conscience, but it seems like, and so maybe that does provide a way out, is you can continue doing what you're doing, but you can also critique the system as a whole and regain some ethical equilibrium in that manner.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of it. Yeah, for sure.
All right. So you're initially an advocate of this. You're excited about it, but what happens?
Yeah.
What, as it rolls out over? And so when did that start? How many years ago? About?
I kind of kicked in 2015, I believe.
Okay, so it's about 6 years we're talking about.
Yeah, and so the word came down. There was a diversity, as I understand it. This is pieced together, but there's a diversity task force on the board. There was a retreat, a board retreat that was led by something called the Carl Institute. The Carl Institute is this outfit, one of these outfits that stands for Critical Analysis of Race in Learning and Education. And, they're, influenced by critical theory, I believe. And then they sort of pitched their tent with anti-racism as a philosophy. And they started to, talk to the faculty a little bit. What later became the Office of Community Engagement, which is the sort of the bureaucratic arm that, is essentially a sort of ethical priesthood of how to behave properly in, the school environment and, how to be a good anti-racist. But they would ask, they had meetings where they would ask us things like, well, what does anti-racism mean to you? And that's a perfectly innocuous question. I mean, to me, I was like, it means not being racist. It means not differentiating, individuals based on the color of their skin, and treating people with respect and dignity, no matter, what their skin color is. And they said, well, that's interesting. That's very interesting. Okay, well, and then they just heard people out, and some people had more, I guess I would say, advanced ideas about, being aware of systemic oppression and understanding different perspectives based on how you might assume a child had been, had developed given their circumstances. And those were rewarded, much more. And those are not bad ideas. We haven't got to the bad stuff yet. But it started to become apparent to me. I sort of had the realization that this was really going in the wrong direction when we had a professional development meeting, and they passed out I'm sure you've seen it, the pyramid of racism, also known as the pyramid of white supremacy. And it had a schema. It was a schema arranged in the form of a pyramid with genocide at the top of the pyramid, and then various layers that had categorical names like overt racism, covert racism, minimization, indifference, and then there must have been about 50 or 60 things sprinkled on the pyramid at various levels. And some of the things on the pyramid, I actually thought were, in many cases, virtues. So things like being apolitical, or things like, there are two sides to every story. Things that were contradictory, like, not believing POC, but also thinking, well, my Black friend said ... So the idea that these two things were next to each other seemed interesting to me. Also things that were just, political party platforms. Things
minimization.
Like,
we all belong to the human race.
Right. That was a big one.
Post-racial society. Why can't we all just get along? Prioritizing intentions over impact. That's a nice one.
Yeah.
Yes, we could talk about that for about 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Not believing experiences of people of color. Two sides to every story. Right. Yeah, well, it's very interesting when you look very carefully at the words that are lumped in with the other words, let's say.
Right.
Guilt by association. Okay.
Yeah.
So you had this pyramid of white supremacy.
Yeah, and I was asked, how do you respond to this? What do you think about this? And I said, I think this is extremely destructive and horrible schema to put in front of a child, and I will never do it. And I think that no. And I went to the office, I said, I'm not teaching this.
And so this was when you were teaching math.
Well, I should explain it. At our school, all the teachers have other duties that are really important. Like you have an advisory, and the advisor shepherds, maybe 8 to 10 kids through the 4 years. So they come to you with problems, and you can help them out. You can help them out academically. So this would have been something that I would needed to share with the advisory. And I think they actually... And
so you registered your objections
I did.
at that point.
This is the first time I kind of registered my objection, because I felt...
Why did you do that? I mean, look what you just told me. Remember what you just told me. You said that at one point in your life, you were like dangerously lost. You found your way out through mentoring. That put you into the education field. Then you got a good job that you liked with people you cared for, that was meaningful to you, and it structured your life. And then you bought into this anti-racist movement, let's say, but now you decide you're not going to do it. So, why? You have a lot at stake at this point, a lot. So why? What's bugging you about this so much?
Yeah, I think some things had happened before this, where I had spoken to the head of school prior to this, and warned him, because I immediately thought I was just thinking about anti-racism. Why does That should be a good thing. Why does that bother me? And what bothered me was that I knew that racism was a concept that had undergone enormous creep, that the people had very different ideas about what was and wasn't racist. To some, the American flag was racist. Things that were, perhaps innocuous to some would have been considered racist to others. And then how would you adjudicate what you were actually against? And I saw this as a real threat because it would lead to real problems in determining what it was that you should be anti. And if you frame in your mission something which is anti something vague, you're really setting yourself up for a witch hunt. And I just
especially, so we look at this pyramid of white supremacy, right? And at the top we have genocide. So it's like the ultimate evil. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the ultimate evil. Okay, so then you might say, well, maybe your definitions matter when you're talking about the ultimate evil. And so maybe being vague about exactly what that evil is, especially if it's convenient for you to be vague, perhaps that's a little bit ill-advised. Perhaps particularly when you're teaching children.
Yeah. And I said, well, is this the comprehensive list of things that belong on the pyramid? Are there other things that we don't know that are on the pyramid? And they said, well, there could be. And I said, well, that's nice. So now we have other stuff that's just in the margins that could be thrown onto this pyramid. Who knows what they'll be? Maybe.
And who knows who will decide?
Exactly. Like this is okay. So this list is not exhaustive, and that actually scared me more.
Why?
Well, because it meant that no one could anticipate where the lines were. I mean, kids need boundaries. And so how are the kids supposed to know what is and isn't if they just have this grab bag of all these possible things that could be, associated with the ultimate evil? That it just is setting up this whole tripwire situation where they're just, how are they supposed to know how to trust what is and isn't falling into the schema that comes out of their mouth, or they have a thought, or that they want to articulate it? How you're just setting them up for anxiety and tension, and who it means that you're really, and I began to see this in actual discussions people have about it. Kids were restricting themselves to a very narrow set of things to say that they felt were okay to say, and it was all the jargon. It was saying, well, we need to acknowledge our privilege. Yes, we are privileged. That privilege makes us unable to understand.
Okay, so what you saw as people's attempts to deal with the ambiguity was that they just stopped saying anything that wasn't approved.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
that is the way out of it, right? If what's negative is ill-defined, but what's positive is listed, then you just stick with the list.
You stick with the list. Yeah, you stick with the list. And then
so what's the problem with that exactly? So the kids stick with the list. Why is that bothering you?
Well, it's because it means that, events, the multiplicity of possible reasons for things that change, that are different depending on the actual incident, get reduced to this script of explanations, and only those explanations, fit the paradigm, and only those explanations will be considered. And that means that you're not making sense of the world for yourself. You're following a script. I don't think that's right.
Okay, so now you're watching this. It's having an impact on you. It's having an impact on the students. What's the impact on the students?
Personally, too. I felt okay. Some of it was personal, but also I was seeing it in the students, and particularly in the most recent years. It's sort of like when you go to a meeting and everybody is there are people that are silent, and there are people that are talking, and the people that are talking are saying all the right things, and the people that are silent are listless and disengaged, and just waiting for it to end. And then that listlessness and disengagement is being framed as resistance by the people who are running the meeting, or the people that are in charge of delivering the anti-racist programming. And then there are meetings about how to get...
Because that's indifference.
Yeah, and so they actually call it...
in the pyramid of white supremacy that in a pyramid, every brick depends on the ones below it for support. If the bricks at the bottom are removed, the whole structure comes tumbling down, which means that if you face down indifference, you eradicate genocide.
Right, exactly. And so it's a way to use a structural metaphor to transfer all of the weight of genocide onto all the little things. I'm not saying it very well, but I think you know what I mean. So we got an email. I remember getting an email from the Office of Community Engagement that said we were looking for ways to target white disengagement, and white was in brackets, right? It's almost as if we're embarrassed to say it, but it's white. It's white disengagement, right? And that's sort of like, we're going to say it, but we don't really want to say it. And that just made me a little bit even more upset, because it meant that if you're not even going to be honest about what you're calling it, you're going to try to have it both ways.
And what's happening among your colleagues at this point? You're becoming dissatisfied. What's the nature of your private conversations? Are you starting to be isolated?
No, I mean, I'm still getting along well with my colleagues, and there are some that I have conversations with, and they'll say, well, I won't go as far as you, but I definitely think there's something not so great about this. I think it's, other colleagues were concerned about the same things I was. I think free expression and the ability to entertain, to have different ideas and to talk about the framework and maybe challenge it, the whole thing. So yeah, I wasn't alone in my doubts, for sure.
Did you ever wonder if it was you going off the rails?
Sure. I mean, I still felt, I still felt like it was perhaps me, in the way that, because I have had privilege in my life. I've had substantial privilege in my life. I would call it, opportunity, and I'm grateful for it.
One of the things that I learned about studying the aftermath of the Russian Revolution was that privilege creeps too. Because it's very, very hard to find someone who isn't privileged in some manner. Like the only person who isn't privileged in some manner is the person in the world who's suffering more than anyone else. And there's only one of him or her. Everyone else is privileged. And so you can expand the net of guilt indefinitely by focusing on privilege. Yeah. And I didn't like the way that it was being used to discount people's ideas. I mean, if you have an educational institution, ideas are everything, and you should be talking about ideas based on what make ideas sound or unsound, not the person who's saying them. So I was seeing situations where, white students would make a claim, and then that claim was discounted by someone else because of their privilege. Right, and but you're making, of course, the white supremacist assumption that there are such things as ideas and that they can be rank ordered in terms of quality, and that the purpose of discursive speech is precisely to do such things, and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and so the whole solipsistic nature of it, I was like, you can't even have a conversation. This is not a way to have a functioning. You're not preparing people to function in a truly variegated world of ideas. It's not. Well,
it's worse in some sense. Yeah. Is that the fundamental claim is that there's no such thing as a conversation. There's just different discourses of power. There's no conversation. Yeah. Conversation assumes ideas and the free flow of ideas and a rational individual actor and the capacity for logos and and the individual as the central unit, and so on and so forth. People who hold the critical race position, let's say, don't, it's not that they avoid confrontational conversations. They don't believe that there's such a thing as a conversation. It's not part of the system. So it's a fundamental dispute.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, and and then the little things, like I remember talking to a colleague about a new hire, and she said, I said, well, what's he like, this new guy? And she said, well, he's like you. He's like me. Well, what do you mean by that? And she was like, oh, he's white. I was like, okay. All right. This is not a person that's a total stranger to me either. And I kind of walked away and like, really? So, okay. And, I also hear the objection to my objection, which is, see how it feels, white man? See how it feels to be treated as your race? That is, it's a, she might have been trying to teach me a lesson in some sense, like, now you know how it feels. But that's not, okay, that's a point that you're making, but that's not a healthy thing. And that's not good, because it doesn't actually
reduce the sum total of misery in the world.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
All right, so you're starting to feel disquiet, and you actually make this known. Yes,
and I make it known in 2019. I make it known in 2020. I talked to the assistant head. I talked to the head of school.
You're married?
I'm recently married. I've been married over a year, just over a year.
Okay. Do you have any children?
No children.
No children, but you are married.
But I'm married.
Okay, so I'm just wondering what you have resting on your jaw.
Exactly. Yeah. And I didn't. I have to say that not having kids is a huge part of why I feel like this is happening. That I've been able to stick my neck out, and I'm not. I don't judge anyone for balancing their duty to the truth and their duty to their family in whatever way that works for them, because both of them are important. Or to put things at risk, that's a personal choice, and I can't speak to any of that, but I think it definitely, not having mouths to feed and having some savings from my previous job and things, being smart with my money and not spending it unwisely as I had done a decade and a half ago. But I think that helped me to do what I'm doing.
All right. So how are you being treated by the administrative officials to whom you're registering your objection? Are you doing that in writing, or are you doing that
in person? Mostly in person. And, I'm not writing anything official. I'm in the grumbling in my beard phase, I guess. I'm in the griping phase, where I would go and I would say, this is wrong. Like, why can't we teach, a broad range of viewpoints? Why do we always have to teach this ritualistic thing that's just a litany of, basically far left ideas? And, some of the administration were very sympathetic, like even overly so. Like, I remember talking to the assistant head. He pulled down a copy of Jonathan Haidt off the bookshelf and was like, "I'd love to teach this in my class. I really want to make this happen. I want to teach, So, more than I was, sort of, or maybe just modeling it or humoring me or something."
But he had the book.
He had the book. That's right.
And he knew the book, and he knew where it was on his shelf.
I know. So like, but then in public, or in public, in front of the community, not saying nothing about it. Right. So I think there's a tremendous amount of preference falsification still going on there.
Well, and, you outlined why. I mean, you lost your job.
Yeah.
So, these are high stakes games, and you make a mistake, and a mistake, you veer outside the realm of acceptable behavior, let's say, and what happens? Well, you get disproportionately punished for it. And there's a moral element to it too, which is, well, there's no bloody way someone like you should be teaching. So not only did we fire you, but we're right to do so.
Yeah.
So, and that's a very hard thing to withstand, which is something I also want to talk to you about. I mean, confident though you may be, or anyone may be, when your institution sheds you and surrounds that with accusations about the nature of your character, if you're not a complete psychopath, it tends to strike you to your heart. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because there's always the possibility that you're wrong.
Right. But I really knew I wasn't, because, coming out, there was this meeting, and I referred to it in the article or my essay, the self-care through an anti-bias lens meeting, which is what kicked off the whole past 2 months for me. It was a meeting where students were ostensibly going to learn how to take care of themselves during the pandemic, how to manage their emotions, how to take deep breaths and cope with things. And in that meeting, after some mind relaxing exercises like meditation and stuff, they put up the white supremacy, aspects of white supremacy culture slide.
And that's different than the pyramid, or
this is different than the pyramid, and this is this is a
elements
thing.
Of white supremacy.
Right. It's actually there's different forms of it, mm-hmm. But essentially it's fairly common in this thing, as you know, and
yeah. So here's some professional and transactional relationships versus relationships based on trust, care, and shared commitments, protecting power versus sharing power, culture of overworking versus culture of self-care mm-hmm. and community care, competition and struggle for limited resources versus collaboration and working to share resources. That's mm-hmm. all white dominant culture. So that's...
Yes. And so some of the things that were on this particular slide were objectivity, individualism, either or thinking.
Right.
And
I know that one.
There was, the thing that rankled in me the most was right to comfort. Because, how are you giving a self-care workshop where the 200 kids that are in there in this racially segregated workshop are challenge that they might not, that imagining that you have a right to comfort is associated with a, genocidal evil.
Kenneth Jones and Tima Oken, Dismantling Racism Workbook, 2001. God only knows what that is, but it's everywhere. The characteristics of white supremacy culture, perfectionism, which is an element of conscientiousness, mm-hmm. which is a fundamental trait, sense of urgency, defensiveness, quantity over quality, worship of the written word, paternalism, either or thinking. Notice this is all written in words, by the way. Power hoarding, fear of open conflict. Individualism, which seems to be run somewhat counter to the fear of open conflict. Progress is bigger and more. Objectivity, right to comfort. Yeah, it's quite the grab bag of conceptually unrelated items. It's incoherent at every possible level of analysis. As well as being, it's impossible to parody.
Yeah. And I saw it, and I had been thinking for a couple months prior to this, because there had been some meetings that really upset me. And I was thinking, and my head of school had actually said that if I was in an appropriate forum, I should feel free to ask questions. By this point in the meeting, I think maybe 30 minutes in before this popped up, other faculty had been saying things in the chat area of the Zoom meeting. So, when this
is that anonymous? Is that anonymous in the Zoom chat?
No,
so they were under their own names.
Under their own names, yeah. And so I thought, well, why, when the facilitator mentioned that if you looked at this slide, I think she said, you might have some white feelings. And I said, I just kind of blurted out. I didn't blurt it out angrily. I didn't blurt it out. I don't think I was too upset. Of course, I don't know how it was perceived, of course, but I said, well, what do you mean? But what is a white feeling? What is a white feeling? And what came back was, I think she said something that defensiveness was a white feeling. I said, well, these feelings can belong to people of any race. And, I think that I don't know whether I don't understand why it's being attributed to a particular, the white people. And, I had, that kind of opened the gates a little bit, and kind of broke the ice, I think, because in the chat, other kids started to ask questions. There was a debate about whether I should be allowed to ask the question. There were
Which question? You mean the question about
the white feeling question?
I see. Mm-hmm.
There were also there was a lot of capitalism bashing in the chat. And I said, I believe capitalism is anti-racist, since it's done more to lift people of all races out of poverty than any alternative. And, I wasn't monopolizing the chat. I was dropping in little things, and there was a lot of activity in the chat. And then the facilitator actually went with me, and she explained stuff, her perspective on it. And I thanked her, and, she moved on some more. And I think I asked another question, but I really, as she said later in a meeting about the meeting in front of the whole faculty, she felt that I was asking out of curiosity. I wasn't, on a rant or saying it, to be antagonistic. I think some of my faculty members felt that I was, but the facilitator herself didn't feel that way. So, and she was the one I was talking to. So I think that definitely counts.
No, that's quite remarkable, I would say, because it's very difficult in a group like that, when the implicit ethos, to be able to say something that's questioning without having anger build up as a motivation, right? Because you need something to break through your resistance.
Yeah.
So to be able to say it without upsetting the facilitator.
Yeah, I mean, I was passionate, but I wasn't. I don't think I was like enraged or anything like that. It's I was trying to modulate. What I was really upset at was the either or thing, because I was like, well, if either or thinking is a characteristic of white supremacy, well, then Ibram Kendi's got to be the whitest person in public life, because his entire philosophy is so Manichaean. I mean, anyway. But I didn't say that, of course, because that would have been inflammatory. But what I really wanted to do, I've been thinking about an opportunity, because I wanted to model for the students that you could ask questions, that someone who was a teacher or someone who was an authority figure could ask a question, and it was okay. And
how did the students react to
it was phenomenal. I mean, I was really gratified, and that they confirmed that I was doing the right thing, because when things came out in the chat, they started to ask a broader range of questions. I received the transcript later, and it was like night and day. Kids were asking questions like, well, I don't feel like I'm ignorant just because I'm white, or, I don't like to be reduced to my race. And then faculty joined in. So several faculty members also started to ask questions. And I don't think the point was that people even necessarily wanted their questions answered in the forum. They just wanted to ask them. I got,
sometimes you don't know what your question is till you ask.
Exactly. Like that's why I think intent is kind of a silly thing, because you never really, it's only an ex post facto explanation if you're called on it. I think like a true question, there may be no intent. Like it just bubbles out of you. If you're truly in a conversation, I'm not thinking about, okay, it's not like I'm plucking this little thing out of the inside of my head and like, well, I intend this to be, that's not communication. That's
not if it's a genuine conversation.
No,
you don't have time for that in a genuine conversation.
No, yeah, of course not. And so, but I was really gratified. I was on a natural high from the experience.
Why?
Well, because I felt that I had done something good. Like it was just self-evidently good to me. Like it just, when I reflected on it, this is a positive thing. Now, one of my colleagues got very upset with me, with my influence on this. And because at one point I did say, why, I don't identify as white. Must I internalize society's delusions about me? Which is, like, it's kind of like the neutron bomb to this entire belief system. but I was on a, you know, I felt like it was something that I wanted to put out there so that kids could see it and, you know, understand, you know, that maybe this is a point of view. You know, I'm not saying I'm right. I'm asking a question. And, you know, the feeling was that this was, you know,
but
anti-racism
also offers
101.
them some defense.
Yeah, like
They're not morally obligated to accept these characterizations.
Right.
Which is kind of the whole point of anti-racism, is that you're not obligated to accept arbitrary racial categories that are unrelated to the task at hand.
Yeah, well, it should be. But you know, then a colleague got upset with me and said, kind of got on his high horse and said, you know, I can't believe that, and I may be paraphrasing here, and if I am, sorry. But he said, I believe, you know, I can't believe that a member of our, you know, one of my colleagues doesn't understand that we are white since birth. I am white since birth, that this carries with it implicit biases that are unavoidable. And we must affirm that, you know, and that's who we are. And that's who I am. And it kind of interrupted him because I felt like he was kind of making me look, I don't know, he's being kind of a jerk. So I interrupted him and said, you know, I'm sorry you're stereotyping yourself. I think it's sad. And, you know, that kind of was a very awkward moment because it was in front of students. And he said, you know, he expressed his dismay. And I remained silent. And then after the meeting, I said, you know, I apologized to him. I said, you know, that was unprofessional.
Was it?
Well, you know, I felt it. I felt that there might have been a better way that I could do it. Maybe wait till he finished and then ask, you know, to respond. I'm also suspicious of my own, you know, because I have been somewhat oppositional. I'm not exactly like a Mr. Go Along and Get Along guy with this stuff, that I don't always have the best reality check on my own behavior. And so I was just saying, well, okay, if I did cause offense, then, you know, I feel like it's okay to apologize, and there probably was a better way for me to do this. And so I did apologize, and, you know, thought about it, you know, nothing against that, nothing wrong with that. And then he accepted. And, you know, I figured that was it. There was a lot of processing after the meeting, I think, that went on for hours afterwards. My phone died. It was on my phone. And so when I went home, you know, I logged back into the meeting and people were still there talking. So I talked with them. But I underestimated the effect of this because apparently some of my comments, you know, were leaked or transmitted to other people that weren't in the meetings, people that were in the BIPOC meeting, you know, particularly my and
BIPOC is
Black and Indigenous people of color. So they were having their separate meeting of faculty and students where they received different content.
And why was it separate? Just out of curiosity.
The rationale, as I can understand it, is so that the groups that have been marginalized won't be exposed to, you know, they'll have their own thing so that they're not exposed to the, I think, the possible insensitivity of the oppressors. That's the best I can understand the rationale. But it wound up happening anyway because
I suppose it would be rude of me to point out that that's somewhat paternalistic.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, just as a you know, observation.
That's a good one. Yeah, I mean, yeah, totally. Well,
I guess that is a characteristic of white supremacy culture, though, paternalism.
Yeah, so I guess it's quite accurate.
As long as it's in a good cause, then I guess it's forgivable.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was how long ago, that meeting?
That was February 24th.
Oh, yes. Okay. So things are starting to
this year. And that was referred to after the fact as the events of Wednesday. Like they couldn't even really, it was sort of like 9/11. They couldn't actually, they had to come up with a euphemism for it, I guess. So the events of Wednesday. And so they had meetings about the events of Wednesday.
And who's they?
Well, the Office of Community Engagement, coupled with the Dean of Student Life. And there are dean level positions that exerted a lot of effort and energy, because I did not make their lives easy, to to address the things that were said and raised in the meeting, not just by me, but by, lots of different people and students. Students, spoke up as well, and faculty. And so what I found it so interesting because the day after the meeting, there was an email that was released that said healing resources, resources that will help you come to terms with what happened. And the first healing resource on the list was a CNN interview with a poet named Damon Young. Damon Young, in this interview said things like, we need to get rid of all of capitalism. We will have to do a carpet bombing, not a carpet cleansing of society. I mean, it was incredibly radical statements that I would imagine would be frightening to many people. And that was listed as a healing resource, as well as things like...
Well, as long as the carpet bombing only targets the malevolent people.
Well, yeah, I guess. And then there was a Robin DiAngelo article that said, white people need to be made or kept uncomfortable. How can we become more uncomfortable? Also, really kind of, I would just say, racist characterizations of white people in these links. Things like, white people have never had to be guests in this country. And
like the Irish, for example.
Yeah.
They weren't really white to begin with, though. So
yeah. And so I found this very ironic. And then I had 2 meetings. I had a meeting with my head of high school and the assistant head. And I had a meeting with the head of the whole school. And then, the head of the meeting with the head of high school.
So they called you in at that point?
Yeah, I mean,
so what's happening around you? Is this growing? Well,
yeah, there's a lot of agitation. There's meetings about meetings. There's student diversity council meetings. There's just a lot of agitation in the community, I would say, and meetings about meetings. So some of the things that would happen would be in the end, as the week continued, there was a faculty meeting about it. I had some advisory circle practice was taken away because they felt that the students would be upset if I was a part of it. So the dean had to run my advisory.
Advisory circle is what?
Well, it's a practice that we've started this year where activities where you put up a slide and you talk about an issue, and then everyone has to go around and speak one by one about a question, and then you kind of do it around twice. And then, this is to sort of manage discussion. And I've done a couple of these. So
you're persona non grata at this now because of your toxic influence on the students?
Right, right.
Or the toxic influence of your presence?
I got an email saying, under current circumstances following yesterday's meeting and your role in what transpired, I've asked you to recuse yourself. Then, there were subsequent meetings. There was a faculty meeting. I think at that faculty meeting, a colleague said, well, this could be terrible. This could undo everything we've ever taught them, which I thought to myself, please, I hope so. And there was...
How are you reacting to all this?
Well, I'm on a natural high. I mean, I know that I feel like this is something that I've finally done to open up something like some daylight. And all of this churn is going on around me, but I'm going about my day. I'm teaching my classes. I did feel the need to address my classes. So I said at the beginning, I am an anti-racist. I want you to feel safe. And then I would just sort of teach the class. And then I was told not to address it with the class, with anyone in the classes. I had sort of had a manic kind of outbreak at this point. Like I felt so much energy and enthusiasm that I was writing in my notebook a lot. And I developed a kind of, I had a sort of creative outpouring through all of this. I don't know whether it's maybe like a cyclothemic reaction or something to it, because I felt like my soul had kind of awakened. No, I was having a lot of trouble sleeping. I was, maybe getting 3 hours a night, and I would wake up at like 4 a.m, just being like wide awake. And I'd go and I'd start writing, and I'd write a lot of ideas down. And I felt like it was really productive.
And what do you think of the ideas that you were producing during that time?
This type of thing has happened before, and I've looked at them with later eyes, and I don't think that I've kind of felt the despair that they weren't, that there wasn't much value to them. But this time,
well, one thing I might point out is that writing is overproduction followed by culling, right? And so you'll have periods of overproduction, and you probably throw 90% of that away, but maybe you keep 10%, and that's a lot more than zero.
Yeah. I mean, mostly what I was doing was illustrating a kind of geometry. Like I had these two axes, and I was sort of laying things out on them because I was trying to make sense of the whole problem of racism and the difference between reality and truth, and how those things are kind of orthogonal. And I kind of laid out a schema that made sense to me that was kind of explaining the whole problem. And, it still does make sense to me. And I still think that there's a tremendous value in it. And I just want to keep working on it.
Well, it's common that those periods of creativity, they're revelatory thinking, and that can be over emotional and somewhat tangential, but it's grift for further milling.
Yeah, and it did
grist for further
grist. Yeah, grist, great grist, gristle. So all of this was happening around me, but I felt like a kind of stoic indifference to it, because I felt a sort of awakening in me that made all of the hubbub sort of irrelevant.
It sounds like you had decided to do this.
Yeah, I think I had been waiting, sort of unconsciously waiting for an opportunity, and when it happened, when I blurted things out and it happened, then I embraced it, and I realized that I was not ashamed, and I was not contrite, and I was proud. I was actually proud. And then when did you write the essay that was published with Barry Weiss?
I don't want to rush you. If there's more to unpack, I'd like to hear it.
I realize that I don't want to tax you as either, but I knew I wanted to write about the whole thing, so I had taken a lot of notes over the years, and so my first draft was about 5,000 words, and it contained a lot of information centered around the actual Zoom meeting, and then the effects on the students, and what had happened to me. And then I realized the reason why I said the thing in the meeting in the first place was because I was trying to model for the students, and that was what was animating me. And so I handed it off to a friend who edited it and really hacked it way down, cut out a lot of the stuff. And then I did another draft where I was really trying to get to the main ideas and boil them down as crisply as I could. And then Barry took a look at it, and
how
she made a few changes.
How did you make contact with Barry?
Through FAIR, because I had been volunteering with them for a couple of months now.
And FAIR, just so everyone knows,
is a foundation against intolerance and racism. And I was in the process of, I still am, helping to build the organization and select chapter leadership in various states, so that we're in this sort of networking phase, because I'm calling people have given us their names, and I'm calling people, and what I'm finding is that everyone has a story. So I can't just be on the phone with them for 15 minutes, and all of the volunteers are finding that there's a tremendous outpouring. It's very emotional. They'll talk about what's happening with their kids. They'll talk about that they didn't suspect that anything was wrong in the culture until maybe a year ago, and now it's clear to them, and they want to do something. And so you really have to really have to listen before you can, just operationally try to plug people in. And, and a lot of times it really feels like I'm not a therapist, but it feels like at the peak, I was making like 5 calls a day, and each of those were about an hour. And you wind up really having an engagement with another human being.
So this is starting to inform your writing as well, and the way you're thinking about what's going on at the school.
Yeah, and so I'm starting to feel like I have a lot of people that I'm, that this is something that's becoming kind of a duty, like almost a moral duty. So that's kind of the background to that. And then the article came out, and I waited, and there's just I've had an email at the bottom of the article, and I was expecting like 50% positive, 50% negative. I would be happy if it was 50% positive. Now, I realized later it's on Barry Weiss's Substack, and it's mostly her fans, but I put the email out in some other places, and I was just amazed that, maybe 500 emails in the first 2 days, and long emails, like people writing. Some of them are just a word or a subject line, but people had a lot to say, a lot of stories. And I've spent a couple hours each day since then going through them and responding to everyone, because it's really important to do that. I think that, I feel like it's just, I can't just, ignore them or just give like a 1-sentence thing, because some of these I try to respond in at least 1 or 2 sentences in a way that addresses their particular situation. And then I try to direct them to FAIR as an organization that can help. And all people of all different backgrounds, people wrote in from other countries.
And what are they telling you in the main?
They're just, a lot of what I'm just getting a lot of pats on the back, just like, yes, good for you. Bravo. Like, this is amazing. Keep doing it. Keep doing what you're doing. I support you. 100%, this is a huge problem, and you're standing up for it, and what you're doing is right. And,
okay. So you publish this in Barry Weiss's Substack, and the school reacts.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens?
Well, they make the claim that that some of what I've written is a mischaracterization, and they're not trying to. I think it's a little blurry to me now, actually, because so much has happened since. So I kind of have to reconstruct what happened, but in this time, so the article came out on I believe on the 13th, and I had a contract to sign for the following year, and part of that contract, my contract is up. This current contract is up at the end of August, but the deadline for me to sign next year's contract was April 15th. And as one of the stipulations of my contract was that I had to attend restorative justice practices designed by the school to address the harm that I had caused students of color and other students.
I see. So you were obliged to be guilty enough to go to be retrained.
Right. And, the details of this process would be revealed to me after I signed. So I was signing something that I didn't, I wouldn't know what I was signing. So I waited.
Apart from an admission of culpability and guilt.
Right.
Of unspecified nature.
Right. And now participation, I thought about it. I was like, well, participation doesn't mean that I have to, say mea culpa. I can participate in it. Maybe it's an opportunity for me to engage, and I thought about it. But then I said, well, that would mean that I was signing on to it, mean that I was legitimizing it by signing it. And so I decided not to sign it. Because if I put my word on it, then it would mean that I was saying that that was an appropriate request to make of someone. So I didn't sign it.
How in the world did you manage to make that decision?
Well, I just really just delayed it and thought about it. And then I talked to friends about it. And then I realized that, no, I'm just gonna let it lapse because, I've reinvented myself before. I've had several careers. I have math skills, coding skills. I figured, if I didn't work for Grace, I could land on my feet somehow. I don't have kids. So I felt like I had options. I felt like no matter what happened, I had faith that I would be okay. So I felt like I could kind of decide whether this was right for me or not. And I could teach somewhere else, maybe not, in New York, maybe I could find like a private boarding school or something that was more aligned with my views or my values.
Have the offers come flooding in?
Yeah. I mean, since the article, places in Coral Gables was like, come to Coral Gables. We'll give you, we needed someone for our math program, Texas, Arizona, Pennsylvania.
Oh, well, I'm very pleasantly surprised to hear that.
Yeah. And, my fears of being canceled are completely obvious, blown away because, that it's the opposite of that, I would say. Now I'm sure there are people that wouldn't touch me with a 10-foot pole, but do I want to work for them? I mean, it's sort of like a self-selecting thing now. I did this thing. The world has sorted itself out. There are people that would hire me. And so those are the people that I could work with. And then why do I need to worry about people who don't want me? It's kind of like, all right. So, and also
you don't have to move forward on false pretenses.
Yeah. Yeah. And, but I think my main gratitude that I feel is that I made my dad proud, and my mother is not with us anymore, but she would have been proud of me.
Why did it matter to you?
Well, I consider him to be a very important person. And he taught me so much. He taught me how to write. He taught me how to think. He's a law professor. He was until he retired recently. And he was a real teacher. He wasn't so much of a publisher. He was a teacher, and he was very popular, very talented. And he would always engage me in Socratic discourse, and he always wanted me to think for myself. And, I do feel like I've probably been a disappointment more than once, to put it mildly, over the years. And so having the opportunity, he's 88, having this chance to sort of do this thing, maybe just one act. Maybe I won't write anything ever again, but at least I've done this thing. And talking to him about it, and it's a good feeling.
Now, the school has stopped you from teaching, apart from the fact that you've not signed the upcoming contract. Right.
They offered me something that I thought was kind of creative. They offered me the chance to participate in a subcommittee of the Institutional Culture Committee, which is a committee that's centered around designing an anti-racist culture for the school. Now I would work under the direct supervision of the assistant head. But they wouldn't let me teach math. They wouldn't let me have an advisory. They would take away all my teaching duties. And that's basically what I would do for the next, June, July, the next 5 months until my contract expires. So I thought of that. I think that what it really is just a way to co-opt me and to sort of put me in a kind of rubber room. I mean, I don't have any confidence whatsoever that any of my any of my suggestions or contributions would be taken seriously, which would involve like complete upending of the entire program to account for free expression and viewpoint diversity and, completely different epistemology. I don't feel that they're going to take that seriously. And so I'm not sure if my continued employment, I don't think that's going to be helpful.
What were the grounds for stopping you from teaching? Well, how was that framed exactly?
Yeah, that was an interesting thing. So I received a threat from a member of the community. It wasn't a physical threat. It was a menacing threat that was centered around my employment, my livelihood. It said a lot of things like, don't dare come back to the school. Your life is going to change. Your future is, you're going to be canceled. You're never going to be able to work anywhere. We will see to it that it was a menacing email. So I reported this email to the school, and, the school got back to me or the head of school got back to me and said, well, if you don't feel safe, we don't ask that we think it's a good idea if you stayed home and taught remotely, only over Zoom and don't come onto the school grounds. And I wrote back to them and I said, well, actually, I do feel safe. I want to come to school. I like to teach in person. And, I was simply bringing this to your attention so that you could take care of this problem. And then they wrote back saying, well, as we will be polling the students and community members to find out whether this opinion is shared by other people. So they treated this menacing email as an opinion. And they said, subsequent to that, they said, well, since the school, community feels that they can't participate in your classes because you harmed them. They were probably
objecting to your right to comfort.
Yeah, probably. And I said things like, well, I fully expect you to maintain order and security in the school. I mean, that's something that you should. And I find it rather odd that if someone who sent a menacing email to me should not have to stay home, but I should have to stay home. What is why am I the one that has to stay home? Why isn't this other person staying home? So, but they didn't have much sympathy for that point of view. So rather it was this threat was taken as a kind of, example of people's feelings of unsafeness around me. So I was asked to stay home.
Right, you provoked them to that degree.
Right, exactly.
Now, you also exchanged an opinion or two publicly with if I've got this right, with the headmaster. You said that in a conversation, he had indicated his agreement with your proposition that
that's right.
White people, but children in your formulation to begin with, were being demonized by the curriculum. And
that's right.
You made that claim, and he said that was not true, and then you released the audio, which I reviewed, and which seems to clearly indicate that he did, in fact, say exactly what you said he said.
That's right. That's right.
What was the consequences for him of that?
Well, I have no idea because I haven't heard anything in the 2 days since the audio has been released at this point. So he's been radio
still
silence.
Employed, as far as you know?
As far as I know, yes. I don't know what's happening there. I'm not privy to. I mean, I still have email. My email account is still active, but I don't. I haven't seen any communications about anything. So, I don't know his situation. There hasn't been any statement from the school at this point.
Okay, so a couple of things that we should cover before we stop. What are your feelings about the importance of what is transpiring around you to broader, let's say, educational society? Let's start with that, with regard to teachers and students in private and public institutions, high schools, junior highs, elementary schools, in your state and across your country. What do you see this, if anything, what does this indicate?
Well, I have hopes. I feel that if students can, if the type of, willingness to ask a question in response to some of these, what I consider to be indoctrination, frankly, at other schools.
And you think that's happening at other schools?
Yeah, I mean, it's no question because of the calls that I've received and the conversations I've had with people all over Pennsylvania, Virginia, Maryland, New Jersey. Their parents are very concerned with their children. They've seen it because of the pandemic through the Zoom classes. They've witnessed what's being taught to their kids, and they're very, very concerned. And they have specific receipts to back it up. And they're sending me curriculum. So I have. This is not simply a rarefied independent school problem. This is happening at school boards and districts all over the country. A lot of it spurred by the George Floyd killing and the reaction to it. I believe it was taken as an opportunity to redress that with misguided.
Yeah, an opportunity for what? It's like I'm trying to figure out, I keep trying to figure out, because I've been concerned about this for a long time. And I still can't get to the bottom of it. It's like, I don't understand exactly. I know there's a resentment element to it, but I can't understand exactly what's driving this and why it's, despite the fact that it's clearly the view of a very small minority of people, perhaps 5%. That's what the surveys seem to indicate. Mm-hmm. I cannot understand why it's making the headway that it's making at the rate that it's making and what it's really aiming at. What do you think about that? Like, what's your sense? Because obviously it's bothering you.
Yeah, I think I have a sense why, and maybe it's a theory. It's not just my theory, but I've seen it in other places or hinted at in other places. I think when you sort of, over the past few decades, you have a gradual sort of leaching from the soil of society of sort of a moral sense, a moral tradition, moral grounding in, long religious traditions. Essentially, when they depart from the public sphere, it leaves a kind of vacuum. And, wokeness is a way to sort of paint by numbers moral righteousness, and it gives people the sense that they're good people. I think people have an almost, I don't know whether it's evolutionarily based, but they have a need to have a moral character and sense of themselves. And if something comes along which is going to offer that and give you that thing, well, then there's a tremendous hunger for it. So people will adopt it quickly. And so you can have, a very small percentage of the population that's pushing it can have a real powerful outsized influence.
Do you have a traditional religious belief of any sort? And are you a practicing religious person?
I am. It's a really good question. I was raised Catholic, and I have lapsed. I have a joke that I use sometimes. I'm so lapsed, I'm prolapsed. But basically, I was a functioning agnostic, then atheist, but I don't feel like I really need a lot of God, but I do need to have something which is like a conscience. Like, I guess I believe in a conscience. I believe in some little mirror of the divine, which sort of is in me. It's not like above me or around me, but it is within me. And so it's sort of like a reflective thing that I can, and it's sort of reactivated, I guess, as part of this whole experience. So I can take in the world and the world of reality, but I can reflect it against something which is not of this world. I don't know how else to describe it. And then
that's pretty good.
What comes back?
I'm satisfied with that answer.
Like what comes back is something that I should attend to. It's something that it is something important, and that is the, and now that I feel like I have that or an awareness of that, it's just like, okay, like I've got,
thank God,
it's been there.
so
exactly. Thank God. I want to say thank God, but I don't know. I don't know that there's a God with a capital G. I just know that there's something which is not of this world, but is in this world. And it's not out there.
So what do you think? Okay. So what about when I read I have two questions. The first question is, one of the questions is, why did you agree to talk to me? And the second question is, what do you have to say to teachers who are wrestling with their conscience in relationship to this issue? So let's start with that one.
Start with the second one.
No, yeah, with the teachers. What do you have to say? I mean, you already said you're not interested in judging people for their decisions, but
no,
you've been through this. You've thought about it. Like, what's your conclusion and your hope, or if it's not a recommendation, maybe it's a hope.
I would just say, stand up for the truth in whatever way you can. If you have that same reflective process within yourself, or if what I'm saying makes sense to you in terms of your sense of right and wrong, if you feel that what you're being asked to teach or what your students are going through is wrong, then weigh that, like do it smartly, but really take it seriously and
why?
Really,
why?
Because it's crucial. It's what will save us. If you don't stand up. Crucial.
That's a hell of a word to use in that context.
Yeah, right. Yeah, the root of that. Yeah. You're being asked, you're being called to do something. And, it doesn't mean that you have to run around and proclaim, and save the world. It just means that you have to do something in a way that is constructive and well thought out, and will help the immediate circumstances in which you find yourself, and help to, set an example.
And if you don't,
well, then you're leaving it up to the next guy. Maybe the next guy isn't up to it, and maybe the next guy isn't up to it, and maybe the next guy isn't up to it, and then what happens then? Then you may not get it. You may not get a chance. You may not get a chance.
If all you can teach is the words on the appropriate list, you could just be replaced by the list.
Yeah. Yeah.
The thing that's so wonderful about teaching is that you get to make contact with someone else with you. And so if that's being whittled away in favor of the approved list, then there isn't a hell of a lot of room for you. And it's kind of hard for me to see how you could derive any source of meaningful engagement from your job if you've been reduced to a set of moralistic platitudes, especially when extreme punishment accompanies deviation from them. So that's the thing I always noticed when I was a clinical psychologist. I always brought, because I don't practice now for a variety of reasons, there's a price to speaking, but there's a price to remaining silent when you have something to say. So you get to pick your price.
Yeah.
So why did you agree to talk to me?
Well, I wanted to talk to you because, you've been a pretty big influence on my life. I followed you from the Bill C-16 video, and your biblical lectures were very, very moving to me. I mean, I had never imagined even that there was a way to sort of harmonize, evolution and religion in that way. It seemed just like a remarkable achievement to sort of kind of find a third way out of along another dimension from the conflict of, is it true? Is it not true? Is it true? Is it not true? It does, and sort of saying it doesn't matter. That's not the question. The question is why does this matter? And I don't know, the way
Yes.
you did it. It was just like
It apparently
mind-blowing.
matters. The question
Yeah.
is why. It seems to matter.
And it sort of reframed it in a way that I couldn't ignore, and that it because I was raised with these stories, but they didn't really make sense in the modern paradigm that I've been, that I experienced as a kind of drifting away. I think that my experience in relating to your work is quite common. I think a lot of people had this experience listening to your work and your lectures, and that finding a way to sort of connect with myself, as when I was a boy, I was an altar boy. I studied the Bible. These were things that were important to me, but I didn't understand them. And finding a way to understand them in a new and better way was just marvelous. It was marvelous, and that it would have meaning for me as an adult is something I never would have even imagined was possible. So that was very important to me, and also that the importance that there is, I don't know. It seems that it almost doesn't matter what your religious thing is. But it is important that there's something important about truth, that truth is important, and it's not the same as reality. And people think that reality is truth, and a lot of it is, but there's some of it that's not. And that being able to, I don't know whether this is something that I'm getting from you or that you actually said, but I thought that you might be someone that kind of understood that, where I was coming from about that. And I felt the sort of kinship there. And that's why it was really important for me to go on your show.
Thank you for talking to me today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure, man.